Welcome to Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions, the podcast where real life meets big dreams. I'm Johanna, your host, and every episode we'll dive into inspiring stories from PAs, doctors, and professionals who are also dreamers and mission-driven changemakers. From the hospital halls to the hearts of our homes, and even into communities across the world, we'll laugh, learn, and uncover the challenges, triumphs, and everything in between as we see life through each other's perspectives. Looking for more joy and balance in your career? Don't miss our free guide, How to Be a Fulfilled Provider, your quick boost of encouragement with tips to help you thrive while juggling all your hats you wear. And if you've got little dreamers at home, check out Little Evie's Big Dreams on Amazon. These stories are meant to spark imagination, courage, and kindness, perfect for bedtime or anytime. Follow along as Evie, a little Sri Lankan girl, brings joy and creativity to her community while daring to dream big. This podcast is also brought to you with love by the Ephraim Foundation International, because empowering children and families in rural Sri Lanka isn't just charity, it's continuing a legacy of hope and creating futures full of possibility. So grab your cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and get ready for uplifting conversations that will leave you inspired and equipped to make a greater impact. Let's jump in. Welcome to Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions, the podcast where we explore the heart of healing, the courage to keep going, and the faith that carries us through. I'm your host, Johanna, and today we're stepping into a conversation that touches every life in one way or another: grief and loss. My guest, Nims Dias, is going to come on the show and talk to us about grief and loss. She's a grief counselor who specializes in walking people through the most difficult seasons, whether it's the loss of relationships, health, or community. Together, we'll be talking about how grief often hides beneath anxiety, depression. It can show up in our bodies, and how we can get to the root of what is really going on. We'll also take a look at the power of words, the risks of unnecessary labels, and how faith can anchor us in the storms we face. If you've ever felt alone in your pain or wondered why the ache lingers, this conversation is for you. Let's dive in. Nims is a counselor and registered member of both the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia and the Sri Lankan National Association of Counsellors. She manages Compassion Room, a mental health service based in Melbourne, Australia, where she provides support to individuals navigating a range of emotional and psychological challenges. Nims specializes in grief and loss, anxiety, depression, and also enjoys working with children and adolescents within school settings. Having lived in 5 different countries, Nims identifies as a third culture kid. Adult. Her cross-cultural background enriches her counseling approach, allowing her to connect with clients from diverse walks of life. She has been married to her husband for 18 years, and together they raise 2 boys aged 13 and 10. Thank you so much, Nims, for coming on the show. I'm so excited because we've known each other for many, many years, and no matter the distance or the time frame of communication, we still are able to just connect at that level of friendship that is because of that childhood connection.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited to have a chat with you about this really important topic of grief. And
Yes.
it's been great to connect again after all of these years. So looking forward to this.
And so it's pretty difficult conversation, grief and loss. And can you share your journey into psychology, and how did you even start with this journey into grief and loss counseling, becoming interested in psychotherapy, and why you focused on these areas?
Yeah, so I guess my journey into psychotherapy and counseling really began when I was 10, actually. I was in the 5th grade, and I had a teacher at school who she just had these reward systems for children who weren't doing so well in school. And she used to say, if you get a B or an A, you can be rewarded with an ice cream. And I thought, oh, okay, that sounds fun. But as a 10-year-old, I could see how these children were actually really changed because of this. They got these good grades. They felt really good about themselves. And I thought to myself, and I can distinctively remember where I was sitting, as I thought of this. And I thought, I want to be a person that helps people like this. I want to be able to encourage them and so that they can see the best in themselves and move past all of their challenges and really excel. And so that's really where my first passion to be a people helper began. But my journey into grief therapy and grief counseling actually started when I had my first baby. And I didn't have the birth experience that I wanted. I had an emergency Caesar, which, I wanted to have a natural birth, and then going through a bit of postnatal depression and anxiety, I had to start dealing with things in my past at that point. And so once I started to overcome those challenges, I thought I'd really love to be able to do this for other people. So that was really where my grief journey began because I had to grieve a lot of things in my past to overcome some of that depression and anxiety. And then later on, as I'm a migrant child. So I had to learn that moving was a grief experience for me too. I didn't even know. I thought grief was about death, but I had to discover that I was grieving the loss of a childhood home. So that's really where I started my journey in grief therapy. And now I help others see that. And I see it a lot in other people's stories as well.
Yeah. And I can speak to the fact that you have always been a person who's always encouraged others, and you just have this like sense of just wanting to comfort and have that understanding of discernment and, just that natural comforting sense about you, even from younger days. I remember that. And so it does seem like a natural fit.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's something I truly enjoy, and it's definitely a part of me. So I'm glad that I'm able to do that for others.
Yeah. And so, as you said, we often think of grief in response to death, but, you moving different countries and experiencing so many moves, just like, we did too, and having that third culture component to life. What are some other forms of grief that you've identified and have helped others work through?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I said before, a lot of people identify grief to be something that's associated with death. And they're right. It is death, but it's not death of a person sometimes. It's death of a relationship or death of a career or basically any type of life loss. And grief is really a natural process that our bodies and our minds need to be able to cope with these losses. It's the way that we adjust. So we need to encourage that grieving process. And some of the other types of loss I would say is loss of health. As I mentioned before, loss of relationship. Perhaps for someone like you and I, it's the loss of home. So there are many different types of losses. And of course, on top of that, you get people that have traumatic losses as well. So there's a whole host of different types of losses in life.
Yeah. And what happens, we kind of know the 5 stages of grief
Mm.
that people go through, but what happens psychologically when someone experiences those slow losses of, whether it be health or chronic illness or the slow losses that we experience in life?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up the 5 stages. I think it's quite well known, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's really interesting because the research is quite mixed when it comes to loss and the 5 stages. So there's denial, anger, bargaining, hopelessness, and acceptance. Some people have said that they do feel this way when they go through a type of loss, especially when it comes to chronic illnesses and diagnoses and those kind of things. But in actuality, people can feel other emotions as well. It's not
Mm.
strictly based on these 5 sort of emotions or stages. In fact,
Right.
it might sometimes be kind of dangerous to assume that people are going through stages and that they will
Mm.
finally come to acceptance. What we are starting to see is that the grief process is actually a dual process. So, what that means is as they cope with the loss, they're also trying to find meaning. And it's kind of a cyclical pattern that goes forward in their grief journey. But a lot of people within, that have these chronic conditions or terminally ill might have feelings of hope, might have feelings of bargaining, trying to go
Mhm.
to a new health professional to find a different option. And, so that's all a part of the journey. But I think as practitioners, it's really important to remember that grief can be any emotion. And people have a variety of emotions when they go through these type of losses.
Yeah, that's a really good point because we all just think of the generic 5 stages, but as you said, each individual and is gonna be unique. In medicine, we see that because no one is a textbook patient either. And
Yeah.
even though you have textbooks, symptoms or diagnoses, but no one is textbook, and so everyone will express their grief in their own ways and understandings and from their own perspectives of what they've gone through, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And
Yeah.
we have to be open to that and kind of, as you said, accept that individuality of that loss experience.
Yeah, but it kind of makes it difficult sometimes for family members or friends to understand, right? What advice do you give to family members or friends who are trying to find ways to support their loved ones who are going through those losses or
Mm.
the individual themselves to help them understand what they're going through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question because the support structure is so important, isn't it, on these
Hmm.
journeys?
Yeah.
The first thing I would really suggest is to know that you can't possibly completely understand what someone is going through, even though you watch it from afar or rather close by. It's really hard for us to completely know what someone is going through. So, having that element of empathy towards your loved one who's going through something, and also being a person who will listen, will just doesn't need to give the advice, but just able to listen and hear what that person might be going through. And sometimes it's just to sit with them in silence, maybe. Yeah. Um, so those are the two things that I would suggest for loved ones to do at that particular time. Of course, there are other suggestions as well, depending on the particular case, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I know with chronic illness and seeing some other friends who have gone through some chronic illnesses, some people, your friends and family say, "What can I do?" But
Mm.
sometimes in those really difficult moments, you yourself don't know what to do,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think them kind of just know if they are close to you, they know exactly what you're likes, dislikes, things that you're needing at specific times, just proactively doing things that would be meaningful, in a practical way that kind of might be more helpful, right? For that support, that communities may be wondering, what can we do for people going through those things when sometimes the people themselves are just too exhausted, too tired, and too overwhelmed to even give advice of like, yes, I need this or I need that or
Mm.
help, those types of things on a practical level, I
Yeah, I
think.
think you raised a good point with the community aspect there. That if it's just the one person, it's really hard to gauge, like, what shall I do now? And I just need to do something.
Mhm.
So we do need other people to come in and support and give, maybe suggestions. But the other side of it is maybe you're looking and watching and thinking it's really your anxiety, maybe, or you're concerned, like, I need to do something, I just can't sit
Right.
here and watch this
Yeah.
happen. But sometimes, this isn't a prescribed journey, you know.
Mhm.
We talked about how nuanced it can be.
Yeah.
And it's just this process. And sometimes you'll have good days and bad days. Some days you'll know what to
Mhm.
do, and other days you won't. And that's kind of okay.
Yeah.
It just needs to follow a natural process, and finding support within the community and with your practitioners can be helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's really good points because I think a lot of us, everyone, has people that have faced difficulties, and we need to have these conversations, more conversations like this that allow us to kind of help understand, even though you said, of course, we're never going to fully understand what another goes through because it's so personal, but what can we do and how can we better understand? Because we, as you said, go back to what has been the norms, the myths of
Mm,
like, be strong, pain will go
mhm,
away if you ignore it, or, you have to cry, or,
mhm,
grieving time frames. After a year, things will be like a whole lot better, and, moving on or not forgetting or, all of those types of things. We're so used to those types of like standard answers
mhm.
and standard procedures, so to speak, but they're not really helpful and they're actually
No.
false, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you brought up one of the fundamental things that grief therapists and counselors want to convey to people is that we've developed all of these different types of myths in society to help us get past grief, and bury it, or say these things to ourselves. We try to rationalize it like, oh no, it happened for this purpose and so it's okay. Or we, as you said, we say things like, be strong and you'll manage it, or time heals all these wounds, so don't
Mhm.
worry,
Yeah.
it'll pass, but often we find that it's just buried deeper. And
Mhm.
the reason a lot of this happens is because we are never really taught how to grieve in life, right? We've been taught how to acquire things. So how to
Mhm.
get a job, how to maybe look for a partner in life, how to
Mhm.
succeed, how to get an education. But what happens when you lose your job or you lose your partner? Nobody really sits with you and says, "Hey, this is how it works and you
Yeah.
just got to do this and this." We're always, we live in that consumer
Yeah.
sort of world. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because I think also it goes to the root of like sometimes a parent doesn't know how to explain it to a child,
Mm,
and or how to teach it or understand loss. Or we try to protect our children also from grief and loss and hide that from them. If a grandparent dies or things like that, or, parents, as that can happen when they're children too, which is different. But if, grandparents or aunts or uncles, most of the time, growing up, I think they keep that away from the children. And so children don't understand how to process those emotions or understand the concept of grief and loss. And of course, on their level, it's a different understanding too. But you work with kids and adults and adolescents. So, how do you work with kids and adolescents through those processes?
yeah. It's great that you brought up kids because they're actually pretty good grievers
Mm,
because they're younger. And so they haven't learnt all the little things that society tells them about how they should be coping with grief yet.
mhm,
They're very, if you notice a child, when they fall down and scrape their knee, what's the
yeah.
first thing that they do when they scrape their knee?
They cry and they reach out for their parent.
Exactly. Yes. So it's almost inbuilt in them about how to cope with difficulties, with a traumatic event, with a loss of, whatever's happened. They come and they tell someone and then they express their emotions. When did that all go away? Right. And so that's a good question to ask ourselves. Like, when did we start being so strong that we had to somehow figure it out on our own? And so children actually cope a little bit better with loss. So when it comes to children and loss, there are obviously certain therapies and things we do with children. But the most important thing I would say with children is parents have to know that it's okay and they'll be okay with the loss. And that we shouldn't shy away from sharing things with them. Now, I'm not suggesting that you share all the traumatic
Yeah.
details, right, with a
Yeah,
child.
of course. Age appropriate, age appropriate.
Correct, correct. And even some, children that are older, there are some details that I might even withhold because listening to things can also conjure up images and things like that. But the important thing is remember that your child is human like you. They are
Mhm.
precious, but we're all built in with this ability to grieve. It's a natural process. We don't really have to turn it on. It's already there. The problem
Mhm.
is that we've somehow turned it off in life.
Yeah.
So the children are able to actually, grieve. So if it's a funeral, take them to the funeral. If
Mhm.
it's, some people have an open casket, that's okay. They'll
Mhm.
understand that that person is now no longer alive.
Mhm.
It's it's okay. They can handle it.
Mhm.
And of course, I've seen cases of children that can't cope or haven't been
Mhm.
able to cope with loss as well. And we have special activities and things that we do with them to basically tell their story and talk about it. So that's another thing we can do with kids is let's talk more about what happened. Let's talk more about what happened to grandpa and
Mhm.
the fact that he's not with us anymore. Let's talk more about how you miss your friends in your old school now
Mhm.
that we've moved. What do you miss?
Mhm.
And that's a part of the healing process, just telling their story. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, unlike us, where we may be more verbal in our approach, kids express it in different ways and through different ways. I think there are, like, I've heard of like art therapy things that, especially for kids who have, lost parents or loved ones or different things, there are like specific things that, art therapy or, expressions that they can go through or have access to help them open up, right?
absolutely. Yes. I think some kids, as you mentioned, respond better to creative therapies. So art, some might prefer dance. I've found journaling to be
Mhm.
quite helpful, or even just an art diary of memories that they hold to just
Mhm.
draw that in their art diary. You can also do things like sand therapy as well. But you don't have to be a therapist to do this. You
Mhm.
can do this in your own
Yeah.
home with your kids. You can
Yeah.
get a toy of their preference, or maybe
Mhm.
it's not even working with things, but actually going to places.
Yeah.
Taking a walk together every day. What is it for your child that really resonates with them and will help them to heal through this?
Even thinking about the griefs that we can go through from, or children can go through, even like moving schools or losing friends, friendships. Going back to that word strong, we're so focused on building strength. Strength, that
Mm.
is that. You have to be strong. You have to be strong. That's like what we tell our kids all the time, right? And ourselves sometimes. But
Yeah.
what is the good and bad of that? Can you break it down a bit more?
Yeah, that's something I've actually been thinking about a lot over the last few months, because I have one teenage boy and one preteen. And, it's all, and especially because they're boys and there's a lot of association with strength and being tough and things like that.
That's true.
I've started to think about this idea of yes, we need to be strong or resilient. I might relabel that and
Mhm.
rename it as resilience. But
Mhm.
but a part of resilience, or it doesn't mean we have to shy away or bury or hide things that we're struggling with,
Mhm.
right? Because I think to find strength, you have to come from a position of weakness and you have to
Mhm.
acknowledge that position of weakness. Now, people think that weakness is a bad thing. When we say weak, it's that negative connotation, right? But weakness is a position of potential, right? It's a position of, no, I'm going from this place and I'm going to move to a new place and I'm
Mhm.
going to learn and grow through that process. So I think, as parents, as caregivers, as teachers, people working with children, we need to remember that we can hold being resilient or strong and not being as strong or having some weaknesses or things we need to work on at the same time, you know? And it's a part of the process.
Exactly. And I love how you said weakness is seeing the potential. of what can be, not just the negative connotation that it is always associated with. Just like failure, we associate failure with the negativity, which, you know, it is a negative process, but you build upon it, right? You
Mm,
learn from those things, just like we can learn from our weaknesses. We can learn because we can't be strong without learning exactly what we're weak at, right?
absolutely.
And resilience, as you said, it's a process because, I've talked about this as well because resilience is, a word we use so commonplace,
Mm,
but it's that whole process of building in the chaos of what we're going through. And we become strong, quote unquote strong, but it's not strong. It's we're building character and we're building traits that can help us overcome this obstacles that we've faced previously. And of course, it may never be the same each time, but each time we face it, we know how to get through. It's like going through an obstacle course, right? You learn how to get through the obstacle course. The first time around, it's totally chaotic and hard, and we don't know what to expect. And then as we go through life and face these different things, we have different qualities that we've kind of learned from and pulled from that experience or this experience that will help us take us to that next step, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think as you said, this is a whole learning process. Like we have to come to that place. And it makes for a great story, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
About about how we overcame things and we are the people that we are today.
Mhm.
I mean, I follow a lot of people on social media. I know a lot of people do, famous figures, and they've
Yeah.
all got a story,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And what people don't realize is you are writing your story right now.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
what will it be and how will you respond? Not to
Mhm.
be, not to suggest that you have to be this ultra strong person,
Mhm.
and overcome everything. No, you can have
Yeah.
moments of weakness and you can bounce back and you can say, this is how I bounced back. And I did do
Yeah.
it sometimes all by myself, but I did it also with the help of others. And yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, we also talked about grief in moving countries, leaving behind communities, relationships. Um, how can we also like unacknowledge or forget or about the grief from earlier in life and then those symptoms kind of resurface later on? What is the process there? From childhood or adolescence or, long time ago, 20 years ago, you experienced something, but you felt like you moved on and then something comes up and you're like, where did this come from?
Yeah. I think you've already kind of hinted at what I want to suggest to how we cope with this is that
Mhm,
you said something comes up, right? Something comes to the surface and
mhm,
it's almost like a sign and it's like a signal. Your body, your mind's trying to tell you, "Oh, there's a red flag here. You need
mhm,
to deal with this." Right? So I
mhm.
think that's the first place that we start. Now, I know some people that do not like these red flags, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
annoying.
yeah.
um,
And we ignore it. We're like, we tend to ignore it because we're like, I don't know what it is. I'm
yeah.
just going to ignore and move on.
Yeah. And oftentimes it's uncomfortable, right?
Hmm.
And we generally push uncomfortable things away. Again, we're doing the burying thing, right?
Hmm.
We're just getting rid of it, or sometimes we'll rationalize it and say, that's not affecting me too much right now. I don't really need to deal with this.
Hmm.
I'm coping just fine. But I feel like we need to be listening to our bodies because our bodies are speaking to us as well
Hmm.
as our
Yeah.
emotions. They're speaking to us.
Mhm.
Our mind is triggered by certain things. That's speaking to us. So we need to pay attention to this because it's almost like it happens at specific times in our lives as well. Have you noticed that? That like
Mhm,
certain period of life, like for me, it started when I was 30, when I had my
mhm,
first baby, and it's
mhm.
still going. But before that, I was functioning just fine. I had my
Yeah.
my way of living, my patterns of life. And I was like,
Mhm.
no, I'm good. I'm good. But
Yeah. Yeah.
suddenly it's like, okay, I've got all these things that are just poking me, you know?
Yeah. 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 Because yeah, you were saying how it came up after having that life-changing event of your first child, and it made you look back. But some of us are clueless, and we don't know how to delve into those things. How did you realize and start to be like, "I need to really look into this," you know?
Well, I suppose it was disrupting my life at that point. So, what I didn't realize is that I had little signals along the way up until I had my first child, but I
Mhm.
pushed it down, I ignored them.
Mhm.
And I thought, nah, I don't need to deal with that because I'm perfectly fine. But when I hit that point where I had that life changing experience, the probably the worst parts of me, surfaced.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite like myself at that point. Now, I say that in the best possible way. You cannot like yourself, but then decide, I need to change, right? And that's what happened. I think we need to make a decision that we're going to listen to those little pokes and those signals and say, okay, I need to get help. And what I actually did was that was the first time I ever tried therapy. And I went and saw a counselor, and I started to develop an awareness while I was in these counseling sessions with the
Mhm.
counselor about what my life had been, how I had come to this place. And that person sat with me and held space for me while I did that, and I unpacked it
Mhm.
because there was trauma there was grief there. There was a lot of unhealthy things, and some of them were not my fault. They were just things that happened to me.
Mhm.
But the important thing was I sat with someone and I
Mhm.
unloaded it. And that was basically the beginning of the journey.
Yeah. And signals can be somatic symptoms that show up in our health, in our wellness, or could it be just like outburst of anger or the depression-like symptoms, or what are some of those types of symptoms that people can kind of
Mhm.
be aware of and like understand what's out of balance in a way?
Yeah, it can be a number of things. So you can have the somatic sort of symptoms. Some people have, chronic headaches, some people have, body aches, different kinds of conditions can arise from, losses and things.
Unresolved. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
unresolved grief and things in the
Mhm.
past. Even things like anxiety and depression come from
Mhm.
grief and loss as well. So, for instance, let's just look at depression as an example.
Mhm.
Depression is looking back,
Mhm.
right? Anxiety is looking forward.
Mhm.
Depression looks back,
Mhm.
right? So it's like things like, oh, I wish things would have been different. I
Mhm.
wish I could have done this, or I wish I could have been this way, but now it's different. So it's a change in a pattern that's happened in the past. And now we're coping with those changes and those losses from before,
Mhm.
right? So, if we are not dealing with the things that have happened to us in the past, how can we overcome that feeling right now? Because it's linked to the past.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how anxiety and depression can be the under, or grief and loss rather, can be the feelings of that can be um, from a result of underlying depression and anxiety. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, there's what I've noticed working with people is that there's often a loss event somewhere in people's past that they haven't explored or found healing or been able to process. And that has led to these feelings of depression or anxiety. And I'll give you an example from my own life in regards to anxiety. So that's something that I struggle with since I was a teenager. And it was actually earlier this year that I discovered I have a bit of social anxiety. So I sort of feel like, oh, I have to, I'm a bit of a people pleaser. I have to make sure people are happy. And well, at least I was. Now I'm overcoming that a bit.
Yeah.
So I had to make sure that everyone was happy with my work, everyone was happy with me, and that that was a very peaceful relationship that I had with that other person or with that group of people. And I decided to explore that one day and I kind of reflected back. Again, we're talking about self awareness and reflection. It's a really great habit to cultivate personally
Hmm.
for personal development. I was
Yeah.
reflecting and looking back and thinking, wait a minute, this is coming from my childhood. It's coming from relationships that were fractured within my family or my family of origin,
Mhm.
where I felt that I was never enough just me, that I had to make people happy in order for them to be okay with me. It was just not enough to be me.
Mhm.
And so I had to sit with that and tell myself, that probably shouldn't have happened to me and grieve that as a child, as
Mhm.
the young Nims, you know,
Yeah.
giving space for that little girl to feel like, okay, you're finally being seen,
Yeah.
and now you can move forward because I had to tell truth to myself. No, that's not true. Though that happened and though you felt that way, that's not true. You are good enough just as you are. You do not need to please people and make sure they're happy and they're peaceful with you. You
Hmm.
just need to be you and that's enough. And
Yeah.
so I've been able to face my anxiety with so much more certainty, knowing that
Hmm.
I have worked on healing a part of myself that was very hurt and
I know how that can be from the personal experience, but I wonder also that people pleasing type of trait. Do you think it's a bit cultural too, in how the mindset of, because we both lived in Sri Lanka for a short time in our childhoods and early adulthood. Do you think that also plays a part? That cultural, because that can also be a problem too, just like our misconceptions and myths that are propagated for grief in general. Some of these cultural components can be false identities that can also kind of perpetuate into our ways of living as we grow older, right?
yeah, I think you're right. It can be a part of culture, the wider culture as well as family cultures. It's just the way that sometimes it's developed within us that we have to please make sure these elders or whatever in the family are happy or your sister's happy, and that can be a part of that collective culture mentality. Again, we have to ask the question of I'm not trying to sort of put down a particular culture or say that's not valid, but I
Right, right.
suppose there are places for that
Hmm.
and there are places where it's not necessarily needed or whether
Yeah.
it's becoming now dysfunctional or toxic, right? So we have to discern and sort of
Hmm.
think through how helpful is this,
Hmm.
right,
Yeah.
for our lives. Because sometimes, I always think about this concept of balance, right? In the world, we're often not balanced. We're all,
Right.
no, I don't want this whole thing,
Yeah.
or yes, I want it completely. But actually, it's holding two things at the same time. Like, okay, I understand that this would really please mum. And I feel like maybe in this occasion it's all right because it's developing this relationship in a healthy way. But maybe right in this particular instance or this other instance, it's not okay, or I
Hmm.
need to stand up now for myself.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I know there's so much to it, and our conversation is only so long. But so
Yeah.
let's, I want to also talk about some other things too. But I mean, I think I'm so glad we brought up that too, because that's also, I feel like, a component that can be discussed and talked about as well, especially with anxiety, depression, all these different things. I think, going back to culture, sometimes a lot of that is part of anxiety and depression that people face because of the shame and the judgment, comparison, competition, things like that too. Develops those identity problems that we face as we grow older. To getting to dig beneath the surface and explore those root causes of emotional distress instead of just managing symptoms. How do we actually do that?
Yeah. So is that in relation to anxiety and depression or? Would that be?
Grief and loss, or whichever topic you want to talk.
Yeah, sure. So just managing the symptoms and
Mm.
how we cope with that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess the only way to cope with, okay, let me start with anxiety and depression because we touched
Mm.
on that a little bit. Um, I I definitely would say that therapies and modalities to help with anxiety and depression, such as CBT or different other types of therapies, are helpful,
Mhm.
right? That's very important to remember. And a lot of
Mhm.
those therapies do help people manage those symptoms as well. When it comes to grief and loss, the only way through it is to feel it, right? And I think a lot of people don't want to kind of deal with that and they want to kind of push it aside, but we have to kind of feel it in that moment. Again, we go back to that thing of signals and, these emotions coming up. We do need to feel that and let that out. Again, we can use journaling and other things like that to help us to process that, talking to a friend
Yeah.
about what's been going on.
Mhm.
And that's really how we would manage that emotional side
Yeah.
of things. I hope that sort of addressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, as you said, with grief and loss, it's something we have to feel. Depression, anxiety, something we have to kind of really dig beneath the surface to find out those root causes, which can be the grief and loss that we
Mm,
never felt, right?
mm. Yeah.
And yeah. So what kind of questions or reflections do you use or to help people get to the root of what's really going on?
Yeah. So one of the questions I ask people is, what do you think should have happened to your life that didn't happen?
Mhm.
Because I feel that if there's anything unresolved with people, it's often usually that question that kind of brings that up. What should have happened to you that didn't happen? So some people will say, I should have had that baby, but actually I miscarried it, that baby. Or I should have married that person or took that relationship more seriously. And, I
Mhm.
didn't. And so that gives a clue to us what we might be struggling with in terms of unresolved grief. I also, whenever I work with people and sit down and talk about things that have happened to them in their past, sorry, things that have happened in the present. So it's emotions and feelings that they're
Mhm.
having right now, sorry, having right now. I ask them whether they identify that feeling somewhere in their past, whether they felt the same way somewhere, maybe in their childhood or in a previous thing that happened to them. And often that will bring up that event
Mhm.
or that emotion
Mhm.
that is unresolved. And that emotion keeps replaying in different circumstances throughout that person's life. But if we're, rooting that or pegging it back to something that happened in the past, then we can go to that root.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you think it's hard for people to connect with their emotional or physical symptoms that's tied to the past? I know I'm sure it must be hard for them to connect. Or why is it hard? Is it more of they can't remember, they don't want to? What do you find that's most common?
Yeah, I do think it is very difficult for people to process these things. And I think it goes back to that earlier point that we were talking about how we've been taught to cope with things in a particular way, right? We are not used to automatically asking ourselves, where's this coming from? Should I go back into my memories, into my thoughts and think about this? So what happens is over life, all of these memories and things, get pushed back and it kind of becomes hardened, right? It's not, we can't access them as easily because,
Yeah.
we're not going back there often enough. But when you keep going back and revisiting memories, it becomes less traumatic because it's almost like you're used to, it's like you said, the obstacle course. Like It's tough at first, but then after a while, you're like, okay, I know myself well enough. I know this is not triggering for me anymore. In fact, one of the major therapies that we use for people with trauma is exposure therapy.
Yeah.
So we keep getting them to retell their story, their traumatic story, listen to it again and again, because then it becomes almost not normalized, but it becomes something less triggering and traumatic for them because they're used to hearing that now.
And is in a way, or
So, yes, it's you do become desensitized to it. Yeah, you're not as triggered to that. Yeah.
uh, yeah, I mean, it's hard to, go back to those issues and things that trigger us. But you mentioned how depression is looking back and anxiety is more of like the future and worrying about it. What do people often misunderstand about depression or anxiety that stems from those emotional losses?
People don't really understand so much about anxiety and depression and the losses is that, they just think that it's something that they can overcome on their own or
Mhm,
something that just needs a bit of a quick fix, maybe. I'm just
mhm,
going, and it's good to see a therapist, it's good to explore, but we're always trying to move forward with our lives. We're never trying to kind of move back and
mhm,
remember things.
mhm,
Um, whenever, well, I wouldn't say never, but we try, to kind of avoid kind of doing that deep work. So I think
mhm,
what people don't understand is that it always helps to go deeper.
mhm,
Even though you sometimes feel like you don't want to, it will often reoccur in different ways and play out in different ways in our lives
mhm,
with anxiety and depression if we don't deal with that underlying cause. As I told you about my own story,
mhm,
I've been people pleasing for many years now. I'm quite good at it. At least I was until I actually remembered why I'm doing
mhm.
this,
Yeah.
right? It's almost like a programming
Mhm,
that was put into my hard drive a long time ago,
mhm,
but I need to rewrite the code now. And we all have the power to do that, you
mhm.
know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because sometimes I thought I was a people pleaser, but, then I don't know, uh, I don't know, it's so like, then I kind of feel like sometimes it feels like the cultural component of, like, I don't know, that's also kind of there too,
Mhm.
but yeah, definitely the word "no" is a good word to know.
Yeah, definitely. It's a hard word at times, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But when especially, I mean, people pleasing where it becomes toxic and dysfunctional to what you're really talking about, that's when you have to set those boundaries
Mm,
and learn what is good for you and your family, your future. Because that's really what we're talking about is the toxicity, the dysfunction that occurs with that people pleasing, right?
yeah.
Yeah, and, even, just talking about grief, because my dad passed away, but when I was in my 20s, but, I think, like, um, it was hard and, you get those, like, um feelings that they never really passed, especially when they first pass away. It's always like, "Oh, they've gone on a trip," even though I was like, in my 20s, when it happened. But then you wake up and you're like, "Nope, it's real." And
Mm,
it's hard, even if, as a young adult, I wasn't a child, but still, losing a parent, is so difficult, no matter what the age, I think going through that grief, uh, and loss, learning about it, it's, I mean, I don't know how to explain it, and that's what the whole point of this conversation is, right? Is
yeah.
that we can't explain because each and individual person expresses grief differently, goes through grief differently. as, completely different as the next person. And so what we may feel as, grief may feel completely different as to another person. And so, I mean, it's definitely an important conversation to have, understanding that grief and loss, because we don't want that grief and loss to turn into
Hmm.
that depression and anxiety
Yeah.
that can result with unresolved dealings of the grief that you can go through or the loss that you face, right?
Yeah. And
And so,
sorry, I think you've made a
yeah.
very good point about how you'll never really get to that place of it's ended now or I've overcome
Mm,
this because
mhm,
how could you?
mhm,
Because grief and loss comes from a place of love,
mhm,
and people are connected to their loved ones, in memories and,
mhm,
those kind of, they're connected in that way. And
mhm,
so grief doesn't really end in that sense. Our lives grow around it, right?
mhm.
And
Yeah.
we find meaning and purpose after
Mhm.
those events happen, and we're growing, we're learning. And I'm sure with your own experience as well, you've found ways to grieve that loss and to keep moving forward with your life, but holding space for that loss
Yeah.
as well. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think like also, because you feel you have to learn that you shouldn't feel guilty for moving on or living
Mm,
your life. Because I was in my 20s just starting graduate school and going forward to other things, and I was excited about that and looking forward to those things. And I think that was important for me to be excited about the future despite having the grief of losing my dad in that same time frame. But I think for me also it helped because I knew he would be excited for me for my
mm,
future, and he would always want me to, be happy for me for moving forward and going forth with my life. But I think, as we discussed some of the myths before, is like sometimes people feel like they can't move on because then it's like they're forgetting their loved ones, and then that keeps them frozen in time and unable to progress with their life, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great point that you've made about its movement, right?
Mhm,
Like it's not being frozen and stuck, but it's moving in time, and that process looks unique to everyone.
mhm,
And that dual process we talked about before of how am I accepting this loss in a sense and still
mhm,
finding meaning and purpose in my life? And
mhm,
you did that in thinking to yourself, oh, dad would have loved this for me,
mhm.
and I'm just going to keep doing this, and not having or keeping that guilt of
Yeah,
moving on, right? And so what progress really looks like is moving in a direction, right? It's pushing
yeah,
through and making small decisions
mhm,
every day to say, okay, this is not there anymore, or I've lost this thing, but I'm still going to try to find some meaning and purpose in an
yeah.
organic sort of way, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, talking about something a little bit different too is that sometimes we can label ourselves like, "Well, I've got social anxiety, or I've got, people pleasing problems, or not, sometimes people don't really have those things, but they're just labeling themselves because it's just a buzzword, right? Or they're diagnosing themselves without actually having a diagnosis. I think that can be kinda dangerous too, because
Mm,
I think mental health awareness is going really well now. People are really more aware of the mental health issues and taking time to actually care for their mental health and doing therapy, doing the right things to help them kind of learn about awareness, self-awareness, and what steps they can do to take the right initiatives. But sometimes are we over labeling ourselves and kind of just, having like this buzzword? Do you think that's also kind of an issue though?
I do have to agree with you that, we're in the age of information, and we have a lot of things now at our fingertips where before we had to go and see maybe a psychiatrist or mental health professional. But it's great to know. And I think it's good to have awareness that you
Mhm.
might have something, or, you're presenting with some symptoms of this particular thing. It's, obviously the information is out there. Uh,
Right.
there's no stopping people from gaining that information and maybe applying it to their lives. However, I think when it comes to actually getting a proper diagnosis, we need to get that done from a professional, because at that point, we will then have strategies also to manage that. There's that quote from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And I know it seems a little awkward in this conversation, but I feel that that's the case with the information we get.
Yeah.
We have all this power and we have all this knowledge, but we have to be responsible to ourselves with
Mhm.
that information. So, you know, while I say that I have had anxiety, for a long time now, and because I'm in mental health, I know the symptoms, I know the
Yeah.
signs, but I don't wear that as my label.
Exactly.
Right. I recognize that this is something that I sometimes struggle with. So I
Mhm.
have an awareness of that. But
Yeah.
knowing that I have this doesn't actually make me a better person, doesn't actually solve
Mhm.
any problems for me.
Mhm.
I have to work at this every day. And every time I reflect and I say, oh, that's the anxious me coming out,
Mhm.
then I work on it. But I never wear it as a label, because I feel that it's not necessary. It doesn't help me progress. But definitely information is helpful. But I don't know whether we should be living our lives from getting information, off the internet or social media or whatever it is. We need to be careful with that. Yeah.
And I think we should not have these things as an identity,
Mm.
because when we label ourselves sometimes with whatever, from anything from mom to, counselor to, healthcare worker, whatever, or we can label ourselves as, anxious or this or that. And that becomes an identity, because whatever we label ourselves becomes part of our identity, right? And so I think that may, cause further difficulty in getting out of those obstacle courses, right, in life,
Mhm.
so to speak, right? Because if we can't discern the difference between who we are versus the diagnoses and the illnesses or the processes that we've put upon ourselves, then how do we break free from those and change our mindset or our belief system underlying to see that actual change, right?
Yeah. And I think what you said in the beginning was very important. The fundamental thing is are we seeing ourselves separate from all of these things, right?
Mhm.
That's the first point. It's not even getting the label or, understanding yourself that way, but
Mhm.
can I hold space for who I truly am on the inside, that I am, unique and, uh, I have all these talents, abilities. I am me and I am not this thing, right?
Yeah.
This thing has happened to me. This thing is functioning in my life, but it is not me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the first place. And a lot of people still are not there. They are morphed with all of these
Mhm.
diagnoses, or they put themselves in all these categories. So that would be the first place to start. Like, can I see myself removed from all of these things? Because
Yeah.
I still have worth,
Yeah.
without that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's identifying what that worth, that what value, and even, going back to seeing whatever our weaknesses are, but seeing what strengths we can gain
Mm,
and the potential we see in ourselves, right? I
absolutely.
think that's so important. And I love that, just, the way you phrased it, seeing that potential in ourselves. And if you have any final last words of advice or encouraging things you wanted to say.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think, that kind of sums up, and we talked a bit about depression, anxiety, grief, is probably two things. The first is, love yourself enough to support yourself and help yourself
Yeah.
through this journey. Listen to yourself. You have wisdom within
Yeah.
you that's speaking to you. Listen and help yourself and support yourself through whatever process you're going through. And number two, we talked about depression is in the past, anxiety is in the future. Live in the present.
Mm.
It is the most beautiful present that you can have. Something I personally struggle with, but I try to remember every day, because when we're here in the present, we can enjoy our lives for what it is right now
Yeah.
and live every moment and make it count.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nims, for joining me. I really appreciate your taking the time on this conversation. And I know that this will be impactful for a lot of people. And thank you all so much for joining us today in this powerful conversation. If today's episode reminded you that you are struggling, please reach out for help. Your life matters more than you feel right now. And I hope that it reminds you that you're not alone in your grief, anxiety, or loss. Hold on to that truth. Healing doesn't always happen in a straight line, but hope is never out of reach. And as we close, remember the heartbeat of this podcast: no matter what you're walking through, there is hope, there is purpose, and there is a God who sees you. Let's keep sparking hope together, and let it be one conversation at a time. Thank you all so much for joining in. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for joining us in this episode of Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. We hope you found inspiration, insight, and a sense of connection in the stories we shared today. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram for updates, free downloads, and join a community of like-minded individuals passionate about making a difference through medicine, motherhood, and mission work. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Until next time, keep sparking hope, keep healing, keep nurturing, and keep making a difference. This is Johanna signing off from Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. The medical opinions expressed on this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be considered as medical advice. Always consult a licensed healthcare provider for personal medical concerns or questions. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast host.